And good evening and welcome to our latest update. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. Tonight, we will discuss our recent trip to Indonesia, the FDA's latest attack and attempt to impose a de facto ban on kratom. And we do have a bright light, Representative Bergman's efforts writing a fantastic op-ed in The Hill that highlights the importance of regulating kratom products. The Q&A is open for your questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Senior Fellow on Public Policy, Mac Haddo.
Thanks, Ryan, and welcome to all that are joining us on this call. And take advantage of the Q&A section on the webinar and put in your questions as we go through this, and we'll do our very best to get to as many of them as we can, hopefully all of them, depending on the amount of time that we have. But first, let me give you an update on the trip that we just completed to the Republic of Indonesia. And it was significant in that the progress that we have seen since we first started the journey to cooperating and working with the Indonesian government in order to ensure that the kratom raw materials that arrive in the United States that are the key to the production of quality and safe kratom products really starts with the harvesting and the drying and the processing of the kratom powder, so that when it comes here, that it is in fact the base for safe products. We had the opportunity in this most recent trip last week to Indonesia to meet with the Minister of Health. It was extremely significant in terms of the disclosure that they made, that they have completed their round of science. And the science that they're talking about is a commitment that they made when we were last there, that they would independently, using Indonesian research scientists, make an assessment of kratom in terms of its safety and its addiction profile. Because if they, of course, they struggle with the very same issues that we do, and where scientists in the United States and globally outside of Indonesia are asking the question about what the true character of kratom raw materials are. And they reported to us that after their exhaustive assessment and the available science that's available to them right now, and based on their Indonesian scientist evaluation, that kratom is properly classified as a medicinal herb. Now, the reason that's important is that it strips the BNN, which is the equivalent of the DEA in the Republic of Indonesia, from being able to unilaterally impose a ban on kratom based on their repeating the FDA's narrative, anti-kratom narrative, which they have been doing for the past 5 years. The BNN has not put one single bit of effort into their own independent analysis. They have repeated over and over again what the FDA has said about kratom, and they use the surrogate of the ASEAN Compact, which is in the Asian countries, they have relied upon the FDA for their information about kratom. You cannot understate the impact of the disinformation that the FDA promulgates daily about kratom and the impact it has on these other countries. But thankfully, the Ministry of Health in Indonesia, which is the equivalent of the HHS, and they oversee BPOM, which is the equivalent of the FDA in Indonesia, have concluded without question and based on their own scientific research that kratom's a medicinal herb. Great news for us. We met with the Minister of Trade, and this is the equivalent of the Cabinet Secretary. So these are the kinds of high-level government meetings that we've been successful in cultivating the respect and trust of the Indonesian government officials as the American Kratom Association on your behalf has worked with them. When we met with the Minister of Trade, he emphasized how critically important it was to the economy of Indonesia with respect to those 200,000 plus farmers who rely upon the harvesting of kratom for their sole livelihood. These are humble, indigent people who would not be able to survive but for their ability to harvest, process, and to sell kratom as a part of their for their families, as a part of this ecosystem that we have developed in actually giving safe products to consumers at the end of the line. The Minister of Trade is committed to help in any way to protect that. And he referenced the fact that in their evaluation of the current situation with respect to farmers and the approach by the BNN to try to ban kratom, they recognize that there are significant climate issues where you would be, if the BNN were successful, that there would have to be the destruction of a significant number of the trees that contribute to the protection of our climate, with obviously carbon emissions and that sort of thing. It is an important part of protecting the climate as we go forward. Then we met with the president's chief of staff and all of the ministry heads and various agencies in the government in a forum that was convened by Mr. Muldoko, the president's chief of staff, equivalent to the White House. And he brought all of these agencies and ministries together to hear their views about kratom, of which there were 3 BNN representatives. At the outset of the meeting, Mr. Muldoko invited the American Kratom Association to make a presentation about the current science on kratom. We have benefited from all of the science that has been generated by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse here in the United States, by the independent scientific research, by the research that's been done about the behaviors of consumers and the consumption of kratom. We walk through all of that in about a 90-minute presentation to the top levels of the Indonesian government. At the conclusion of that, Mr. Muldoko invited the BNN to make their counter presentation. They had 3 representatives, the deputy of the BNN and 2 of their leading scientists that they at least purport to be leading scientists. And what they did is they spent a good part of 25 minutes repeating what the Food and Drug Administration says about kratom. And I can tell you that it is the same set of disinformation, of misdirected information, incomplete, inadequate, and inaccurate information that they simply repeated. Now, to their credit, they don't know. They don't know that the FDA literally engages in this kind of disinformation about kratom and don't understand the context of the battle that the FDA has embarked on kratom since 2016. Well, actually since 2012, and we'll discuss that in a moment. And at the conclusion of their presentation, Mr. Muldoko then invited the Ministry of Health, and also there's a new agency that's relatively new in the Republic of Indonesia. It's called BRIN, and it is an agency that is comprised of all of the research scientists that do any kind of research for the Indonesian government on a variety of topics, including health-related substances like kratom. And they reported to Mr. Muldoko not only the results that we heard from the Ministry of Health, but also a description by the BRIN people, those that are doing research, that while they will continue to do additional research and reach out to the potential therapeutic benefits that kratom offers, they have concluded as a base that kratom is not addictive, is dangerously addictive, and that it does not pose a risk of safety to the Indonesian people. And therefore, they supported the decision by the Ministry of Health to classify kratom appropriately as a medicinal herb. And obviously that comes with some requirements for the use of kratom under that context. This was a fabulous step. And Mr. Muldoko then instructed the BNN that the president of Indonesia, Mr. Muldoko, supports kratom, that it is the policy of the Indonesian government that kratom is to be protected and that the farmers who rely upon it for their livelihood are an important part of the economy of Indonesia. And unless the BNN could make their case definitively and not just rely on the FDA, then the policy of the Indonesian government was in place, and that is that kratom will be viewed as a medicinal herb and that they will continue to do research to look at the potential therapeutic benefits that kratom may offer as they go forward. Same position we're here in the United States. Same players here as we have in the United States, where the FDA remains, like the BNN, locked and loaded in their wrong-headed view about this plant. We also then had the benefit of having a private dinner with Mr. Muldoko, and we discussed the fact that the biggest impediment from a regulatory standpoint to the free trade of kratom and obviously to the economic well-being of the farmers who currently can't operate in a traditional commodity-based trade system where they get paid at the time that the harvesting and the drying of the kratom leaves is completed and when they've crumbled them in order to produce them to the processors to allow them to be ground into a fine powder. The current import alert gets in the way of that. because there's no system in place in Indonesia that allows for the testing of those raw materials, and the risk is assumed by the farmers and by the processors, because vendors in the United States are not going to pay for kratom raw materials first until they receive the kratom in their manufacturing facilities, and that's derivative of the import alert. It gets in the way of good trade. It is a deliberate block by the FDA in order to impose onerous requirements on people that are engaged in the commerce of kratom going forward. And so from that standpoint, that import alert is the worst thing that can happen to those farmers. And then, of course, the other issue that's critically important is that the vendors in the United States are not going to pay for product until they know that it is safe. And that means that it's been tested, evaluated for the contaminants that we know are inherent to any kind of botanical product, E. coli, salmonella, and heavy metals. They want to make sure it's a safe kratom product. That testing is a critical part, and what we have advocated for, both here in the United States, but also in Indonesia. And so Mr. Muldoko has agreed that going forward, the Indonesian government is going to aggressively develop a testing system with a state-owned independent government laboratory that will test all kratom raw materials from these sources in Indonesia prior to export. And that will be an important part of the petition to the FDA to remove the import alert. Because the import alert, ostensibly, if it follows the law here in the United States, can only be imposed if there is a threat to the safety of the public from this botanical product. But the FDA has done something far-reaching and exceeds and stretches their discretionary powers that the Congress gave to them to act in certain situations, and they're abusing that power by saying that all kratom products are presumptively adulterated, because in the view of the FDA, they believe that kratom is an unsafe product, and what the FDA has done is abuse their authority so that they can impose a ban that can only, under US law, be imposed on a product like kratom, but under the Controlled Substances Act, a decision that is made by, in fact, the Drug Enforcement Administration, following the rigorous scientific criteria for such scheduling procedures. The FDA has failed 3 times. We all know this. August the 31st of 2016 was the seminal date of the war on kratom that the FDA brought to us. We responded to it, but the FDA persists in that. And it was on that date that they tried and submitted their recommendation to the DEA under the emergency power section of the Controlled Substance Act, which, by the way, is reserved for street drugs that pop up that just out of the blue, somebody concocts a scheme to formulate some kind of product that proves to be deadly. That section of the law was designed to attack street drugs that pop up intermittently and swat them down. The FDA abused their authority in 2016 to try to classify kratom, and in the data that they provided showed 7 years of data. This wasn't a street drug. This wasn't something that emerged as a threat to the American people. This was something that the FDA abused from the very start, and it's their mantra now that they don't care about the law. They don't care about the regulations that govern them. They are hell-bent to do what they want to do, which is an extension of their battle against dietary supplements in general, botanical supplements, and kratom. And the kratom is the latest at the end of the spear, but trust me that dietary supplements continue to be poked on it, and the FDA is going to do everything it can to ban and to strip the freedom of Americans to make intelligent, informed decisions about the products that they can use for their health and well-being, which they have the constitutional right to do. And the FDA wants to get in the way of that by abusing the regulatory powers that Congress has given them. In 1995, they did the same thing for dietary supplements and vitamins. The FDA promoted the same narrative, same playbook about that they're using today against kratom, claiming poorly formulated products, irresponsible vendors in the marketplace. People were having adverse events and people were dying. And their solution, the solution the FDA always comes to, is let's ban those products, force them into the sieve of the new drug application process. The Congress wisely in 1994 made the decision that they would simply restrict the ability of the FDA to interfere with the freedom Americans have to use products like this. And they developed, under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, the pathway in order to allow for dietary supplements to be approved for the marketplace and safely be marketed to the American people. The FDA wants to come around and use that same playbook, and the Congress is going to have to react and do the very same thing that they did in 1994 with respect to kratom. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I think that that the commitment by the Indonesian government to help and attack the FDA's position on kratom and to appeal the current structure of the import alert will be an important next step as we go forward to challenge the FDA in their anti-kratom war. So all of those are very important things, and we had a great meeting where it's a long trip. And it requires a lot of commitment, but I think we're there with the Indonesian government to see a great success going forward. And I'll tell you that as we have observed the progress and the improvement of the processing facilities for kratom, when we first went there 4 years ago, we saw that the predominant method of harvesting kratom was as they plucked it from the leaves, they laid out the kratom leaves to dry in the sun and bake them in order to dry them, expose them to all of the elements, including the potential contaminants that come from livestock, from insects, from very unique kinds of microbes that exist in the Indonesian landscape. And they obviously had real significant problems with potential vulnerabilities of contaminants entering the kratom product. Today, we see dramatic improvements. It's not perfect yet, but they're getting there. They actually have what they call greenhouses where the kratom leaves are placed into these drying sheds. They're covered, so they're not baking in the sun, and that's what creates dangerous levels or potentially dangerous levels of 7-hydroxymetrogenine, because that's not an alkaloid constituent of the natural plant. It's a process by which the metabolite develops based on how it's handled and dried that would create a potentially unsafe level of 7-hydroxymetrogenine. They're now putting them on shelves, so they're not lying on the ground. The workers are using gloves and they're working to improve sanitation, and that's improving dramatically. Now, a key part of this process is that when those kratom crumbs are delivered from the villages to the processing, what's the status of that process? We walked into a kratom processing facility that is the state of the art, as good as I've seen in my 40 years in working in the dietary supplement industry. You have the automatic covering of your feet with the little booties. You have an airlock system as you go through that blows off all of the potential dust and contaminates from your clothes. You're obviously wearing masks and hairnets. All of that is indicative, and you walk into a clean room where the kratom is being handled. That is a dramatic improvement over what we saw in four years ago, and certainly immense progress is being made. And when I reported this to Mr. Muldoko, he committed that that's going to be the standard that the Indonesian government will have for the processing of kratom raw materials, so that the raw materials are safely exported into the United States. And he's committed to a structure that will assure that. And part of that is that we will then test here in the United States all of these raw materials, which will eliminate any objection that the FDA would reasonably have in imposing an import alert. And we can use the process that's available to anyone that's on an import alert to appeal to the FDA to be removed. And that process will commence relatively soon, and it will take away another one of the weapons that the FDA unfairly uses against us if they were to fairly evaluate that. I don't expect that, by the way, but Congress will, because they're the one that passed the law that empowered the FDA to do this kind of thing. And they're not going to take kindly to a rogue agency that is abusing their regulatory authorities in the way that the FDA currently is on import alerts on kratom. So before I get into the main core of this, I also want to make a comment about Shayna Brown. And for those of you that don't know about Shayna, you need to be educated. This is a woman who purchased legally a kratom product in the state of Florida, drove across unknowingly the state line in Alabama in an unmarked road, was subject to a DUI stop, which is commonly used by the local police department in that particular area to entrap people or to catch people that are driving impaired. Shayna Brown was not driving impaired. She had not consumed any amount of kratom that would have rendered her to be impaired in any way. And when she was stopped, she readily disclosed that she had, because it was obvious sitting there, this kratom. In the state of Alabama, it is a criminal penalty to possess kratom. She possessed a relatively small amount of kratom product, but under Alabama law, possession of any kratom makes you a distributor of the kratom. Even though this kratom was for her own personal use, that she was using it for a legitimate purpose, she had purchased it legally. She's been sitting in jail for an extended period of time with a ridiculously onerous bail requirement that has kept her in jail. We're hearing that there's progress. There's attorneys down there that know how absurd this particular arrest has been. Her incarceration without being able to get out to prepare a defense is constitutionally unfair. And yet that's what's happening in Alabama. We've got to help, assist. Go to our website, look at the emails we've sent. You've got to help this woman and not only raise the bail, but also raise the money to defend herself, because we're the ones that are on trial in this circumstance. Because if they can get away with that, what they're doing now to Shayna Brown, they can do it to any of us. And I think that it's a follow-on to what happened to Marshall Price in Arkansas, another state where the ban resulted in an arrest, which is highly suspect in terms of the way that happened, ended up with a conviction with Marshall being put into jail for at least 10 years under the statute, which is a similar penalty that will be experienced by Shayna if she's convicted. And he ended up dying in jail under suspicious circumstances. He would never have been in jail if there was a rational policy about kratom. So please educate yourselves about Shayna Brown and help when you can, because this is an important effort. And I applaud those in the kratom community who have stood up, who raised their voices to support Shayna, because, as I said, but for the grace of God, there go we. We've got to help, and we've got to fight back against this absurd policy. So thanks to all that will do that. This is an important area. There are three things that I wanted to cover on this webinar tonight that I think if you walk away from it, hopefully you'll listen to these three things. The first is that the recent July 21st, 2023 restatement of the FDA policy called the FDA and Kratom is the most significant threat to the freedom of consumers to make informed choices about products they use for their health and well-being since August the 31st of 2016. I am not overstating that. This is the most egregious and outrageous abuse of power the FDA has ever to date exercised their authority in, because what that particular advice concludes in their updated thing, and you should read it, is they said, therefore, kratom is not lawfully marketed in the United States as a drug product, a dietary supplement, or a food additive in conventional food. That statement means that you cannot consume kratom legally in the United States under the definition and the authority that the FDA has seized, because they don't have this authority under US law. That's what they're saying. Now, remember, there's a method to their madness, and it is indeed madness. They're saying this because they know that there are people in the supply chain that are selling kratom products, that's going to be their warning. They want retailers to look at that and think, oh, I'm violating the law. Those retailers are not violating the law. They're expressing a counter opinion to the FDA, because that is all this is the opinion of the FDA. It's not supported by science, because if it were, kratom would be banned. Because remember, they have an obligation, they being the FDA, to produce evidence and data that would sustain, under the Controlled Substances Act, the very thing that they're claiming here, which is that kratom is somehow dangerous. They have an obligation to do that. They are abusing their authority, abusing the law, and Congress is going to have to step in to fight them. And we've all got to recognize we are now at this critical point that it is the most dangerous action the FDA has taken since they were snubbed back on August the 31st of 2016. We can't understate the threat that exists to us today, and we've got to rise up. And I know since 2016, look at where we are. We have fought battle after battle, and we are today not in a situation of fighting against a ban on kratom that's legitimately raised. We're actually fighting for good regulations to promote the safety of kratom products that are made available to the American public. That's our fight. And the FDA wants to divert us from that fight, and they want to raise this false flag, claiming that they have determined in their own unholy authority that kratom is somehow effectively banned because it cannot be sold. It will have significant impacts in the marketplace if this statement is allowed to stand, if their opinion is allowed to become the law of the United States. And we've got to fight back. We're prepared to do it, but we're going to need your help. This can't be what we have become, fat and sassy, relying upon others, because guess what? We win all the time, right? We've had great successes, and we should be proud of those, but they are under threat. And we've simply got to rise up and say that we're going to be prepared and willing to fight. So that's the first thing. It is the most significant threat since 2016, and we've got to rise up and meet it, and meet that threat and beat it back just as we've done before. The second point I'll make, There is an enemy within. We have today irresponsible vendors who refuse to accept regulations. That's a fact. You have vendors who claim and cloak themselves in their libertarian views that say the FDA is bad. They are. They'll say that the FDA is acting irresponsibly. They are. They'll say that the FDA doesn't have the authority to ban kratom, which they don't. But what then those irresponsible vendors do is they say, well, because they don't have all that, then I'm going to do whatever I damn well please. And I'm going to just go ahead and put kratom products into the marketplace. And I'm not going to knuckle under to the FDA that requires me, if all things were equal and they weren't out to ban kratom, the FDA would appropriately require for the manufacturing of this food product using good manufacturing standards, good labeling practices, good packaging standards, good warning labels. That is an appropriate way for regulating kratom. But these irresponsible vendors want to act as though they have some God-given right to just put kratom products into the marketplace because they can enrich themselves financially. They don't. And if the FDA finally gets back, and they eventually will, to responsible regulations, you will clean out a significant number of these irresponsible vendors, and they should be cleaned out of our industry. Vendors who deliberately adulterate kratom. There is no question that that's occurring in the United States today. In order to get a competitive advantage, you have vendors who are deliberately spiking kratom products to give the product an effect that it does not otherwise have. And it's beyond imagination that this kind of thing happens. So look at the best example that's now rippling through the media about the case that was concluded down in Florida of a mother who died ostensibly because of kratom. Now, there was no defense offered by the vendor in the court case. And so this was a judgment, a default judgment that was issued, and there wasn't any evaluation of some of the important factors in that case. And looking at some of the reports in the media about the autopsy, there are indicators that this individual that passed away, in fact, had some health problems that should have been examined in the context of any kind of a contested area, but it's been allowed to go through because the vendor did not offer any defense. But the vendor was absolutely, completely 100% wrong, because if you look at the product, it is essentially a vacuum sealed plastic pouch of kratom extract products. Go and look at the court pleadings. It is astounding that anyone gets away with this. With a Sharpie, they scribble on it space dust. There's not any indication of what's in that product, other than it was generally characterized and marketed as an extract product. We don't know whether the extraction methods that were used meet FDA standards for food grade solvents to extract the product. We don't know what the levels of those products of the extract was in for metrogenine. We don't know what the levels of 7-hydroxymetrogenine was. We don't know if there are residual industrial chemicals that should not have been used in the extraction method were actually in that product. We know none of that because there's no labeling. There's no affirmative declaration about what's the contents of that product were or its safety. There are no directions for use. This is an irresponsible vendor who should not have been in the marketplace. And trust me, if the FDA were doing their job today, it wouldn't be on the market. And yet this vendor did it. And there are many, many others like that who cloak themselves, again, in this, I'm doing the right thing. I've got a great consumer base and I'm acting responsibly. I would never hurt anyone. And they're wrong. They don't have that freedom to do it. And then sadly, there are consumers who feed this gray market for consumer products. Price is important. I get that, particularly in this economy. And so if you're using kratom and you say, okay, I can trust Farmer One over in Indonesia that's directly selling to Vendor One in the United States, who then sells to me. I trust that. I've done it for years. If there is not adequate testing of that kratom raw material, you are playing Russian roulette, because even the best operations in the food processing of botanical products end up on occasion with Salmonella E. coli that kill people. And that's why you hear about reports of fruits and vegetables that are shut down once the FDA is able to trace back where the vulnerability occurred. And it's simply a mistake in some cases. But to be able to say that you're going to trust because Farmer One sells to Vendor One in the United States and we trust them, that is a misplaced trust. And that is not the way that the kratom marketplace should be structured. And it is not what consumers should be doing just because of price. And I get it. It is expensive to go through a process that, as I described, has a quality food grade, clean room process for safely manufacturing kratom raw material for shipment into the United States. When it arrives here, it is expensive to buy the equipment that's necessary to produce safe kratom raw material, finished products from that raw material. It requires testing, it requires equipment, it requires training of your employees, it requires a set of protocols that are expensive to clean that equipment after every batch of material, and you have to regularly have independent testing. All of that adds expense. All of that adds to the price. And so it is unfair. The bottom feeders in our industry are bypassing all of those requirements and selling cheap kratom in order to the marketplace to make themselves a buck. And I will grant them that they're obviously trying to act in good faith, but it's not the right that they have to put all of us at risk in order to do it. And consumers cannot allow the desire to have a low price override the importance of responsible kratom vending in the United States. Now, there's no question that the farmers over in Indonesia will, they're poor farmers, they're humble people, and they just want to make a living, and they're desperate people in that sense, because whenever an import alert gets in the way and there's a container that's seized, they're out a lot of money. And so there are some unfortunate farmers over there who are starting to add other botanical material into the kratom that's not kratom in order to increase volume and therefore increase their economic benefit from it. That's sad, but it happens. And that's why testing is so important. And that's why that added expense in the supply chain is critically important to us. And our responsible behavior is the only way we're going to save our industry. In the United States, there are some of these vendors who are spiking their products with adulterants merely to gain a competitive advantage, to mislead consumers who think they're buying a quality kratom product. And when they take it, it gives an effect that is not typical of a pure kratom product. But the consumer thinks, wow, this must be a purer product than what I've been buying in the past. Trust me, if you get a euphoric high from a kratom product, it's spiked, it's adulterated, it's illegal, and it's dangerous. And we simply can't put up with that. The vendors don't do it to harm people. They do it to, for the most part, to increase their competitive advantage and increase their profits that come from these kinds of products. I was at the Champ Show 2 weeks ago, and we saw one of the other problems in this industry about vendors who are acting irresponsibly. There is a number of new products that are now being marketed that were openly being displayed and offered for sale at the Champ Show, which is a trade show of kratom vendors and other suppliers of business-to-business products. There is a 7-OH purified powder. There is a 7-OH vape pen. 7-hydroxymetrogenine is a powerfully addictive and dangerous substance that in the kratom plant as a metabolite doesn't occur at a level that has any health impact, but in its purified and extracted form, it is dangerous, and yet they're openly selling it. It isn't possible for there to be a more irresponsible view of product development within an industry that is already under threat. I get it that their innovation is a powerful driver in any mature industry, but we have bigger fish to fry before we get into the new product innovations and deciding whether they can be safely formulated. And that is to get by the basic issue about whether kratom raw materials and pure kratom products or extracts properly extracted using FDA-approved food-grade solvent mechanisms and procedures. That's where we ought to focus our efforts, and consumers should reject any of these nonsensical new products that really are tinkering with and enhancing and concentrating in an unsafe way the kratom raw materials. It all comes down to one thing: price, price, price. If it seems too good to be true, it is in terms of price. If it's cheaper than a brand name that you know is responsibly being manufactured, don't buy it, because you're feeding the monster that eventually is going to hurt the entire industry. Third thing, the unholy alliance between the FDA and some unscrupulous trial attorneys who exploit families who have lost loved ones who they want to entice into their kratom lawsuits, when kratom really has nothing to do with the death of that individual, but yet they're spiking it, those deaths, and by advertising, saying if your loved one was taking kratom at the time they died, then you can be part of our lawsuit. It would not be surprising, based on data from Johns Hopkins University, that there are a significant number of kratom consumers in the United States who are using kratom to wean off of a dangerously addictive and deadly drug. If in the course of that journey, trying to get off of that drug, would not be surprising that a person might die. right? Because they're trying to help themselves and they didn't make it. Kratom isn't the cause of that death. It would be the underlying product that they were using. They were trying to wean themselves off of. And yet you have some of these unscrupulous trial attorneys that do not care about that. They just want to loop them in to develop a class action suit, not to protect those families. Because if that were the case, why aren't those trial attorneys adding the FDA to their lawsuits? Because it's the FDA that is responsible for allowing products like space dust be on the marketplace. They're the ones that empower it because they won't put in regulations that restrict those kind of products. They're playing around with just trying to ban kratom overall. That helps the trial attorneys because they can go to the judge or jury and say, oh, these awful products, the FDA wants them banned. They don't allow these products to be sold. That's what they want. That unholy alliance is a disastrous combination that we simply got to fight back. Look at what the FDA has done. They have the rumors page. Now, everybody is going to look to the FDA if they believe that the FDA is an honest broker, which it's not. They are a pack of liars when it comes to kratom. If the juries and judges rely on that, the FDA's rumor page is a significant threat to the kratom community. You have medical examiners who, on the most ridiculous bases, will claim that kratom is a metrogenine intoxication that caused the death. They don't even test for it anymore. They don't even know. You could put a medical examiner under oath and say, what is the level of toxicity for kratom that will cause a fatality? And do you know what the answer is? They don't know, because no science has been developed to date that demonstrates that there is a toxic level of metrogenine that would cause a death. There's no one-to-one relationship. They concoct things in order to try to wrap it around, but medical examiners don't have that ability. They simply follow, like sheep, the FDA. And we know that's the case. There's an example in an article that was just published here in the last week, talking about one kratom death, where the medical examiner actually admitted that the level of metrogenine that the individual had consumed that was in the blood tox screen wasn't significant, but he called it a metrogenine death. And he said, well, the person had been using kratom for a long time, so that must have been what killed them. What kind of nonsense is that? That's not science. That's voodoo stuff. But they're feeding the monster because they've got the FDA saying that's what you should do. They've got the National Forensic Toxicology Labs out spewing that disinformation for their own economic benefit because they get to test for kratom now. And then you've got the trial attorneys that are again just playing the game. All of it is a hoax on the American consumer, and we've got to stand up and fight it. And we're doing that, but we need your help to do it. You have lawyers that are out there conflating safe products with adulterated products. You'll hear them talk about, oh, the problem is these concentrated extract products, and they wail into the wind about how is it that you can walk into a store and you see kratom being sold right next to Skittles. This is nonsense. First off, if there is a responsible manufacturing process, it doesn't matter where you buy that kratom product, as long as it's responsibly manufactured using good GMP practices, labeled and age restricted. That's all that is required. If you have a patient population and about a third of the kratom consuming public is using kratom in order to wean off of more dangerous substances and to maintain their livelihoods and address acute and chronic pain issues, avoiding potential overdose deaths, then that should be accessible to everyone. And I hear the FDA, they say, oh, we're concerned about people that are sitting at home self-medicating with kratom. And that's wrong, because they should be getting help from a medical professional. First off, because of the stigma associated with addiction recovery, and because of the financial hurdles that are in place for many people, there is a significant part of the population that simply can't access that kind of service. And the FDA's hollow claim that, oh, people are self-medicating, if they wanted to hold true to that complaint, then why have they sat silently while there have been kratom manufacturers in the United States who are making illegal therapeutic claims in order to induce consumers to buy their products? And that's happening. There's no question about that. The FDA in its FDA and Kratom website actually says this statement. When you look under, it says, how is the FDA protecting the public from the risks of kratom? This is on their website. It says the FDA regularly exercises its authority to protect consumers from firms selling unapproved kratom drug products and making false or misleading claims about unproven benefits of kratom. That's what the FDA says. That's not true. We have produced over the last 3 years more than 75 documented complaints against kratom manufacturers who are using illegal therapeutic claims that induce people to self-medicate, that the FDA claims that they're regularly exercising their authority to interdict, and not one prosecution. The FDA is lying to the American public when they say that. It is not true. And for them to say it is egregious, it's wrong, and we need to call them out for it. And we're planning, and we're doing that every day as best we can. Obviously, that's our challenge. So in front of us, we have this call to action. We need to re-energize ourselves, set aside the differences we have in this community, and there are many. The voices that want to say, oh, the AKA is trying to restrict our access to kratom products because they want the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and we should have the freedom to do whatever we damn well please. Well, those people are wrong. But let's set aside that, because guess what? You're not going to have any kratom products. Everything will be on the black market. There will be no regulations, and you're going to have the Wild West completely if the FDA gets their way. So we've got to fight back just as we did in 2016. And the game plan's in front of us. We know that we can do it. We're going to continue to pursue the state KCPAs because that's the biggest threat to the FDA, and they know it, and that's why they're reacting the way they're doing it. And as Ryan mentioned earlier, you had this magnificent op-ed that was published in the Hill magazine. And by the way, the Hill magazine is a creation of the US Congress, where you have a group of readers in the form of congressional staffers, thousands of them on Capitol Hill, and you have members who regularly read the Hill magazine. And Representative Jack Bergman from the state of Michigan, who is going to be the primary Republican co-sponsor on the House side, wrote this fabulous op-ed about how there are attempts to get in the way of veterans who are saving their lives using kratom and getting off of the Veterans Administration approved drug therapies that they're using for service-related injuries to manage acute and chronic pain. And they're saving their lives with kratom. We had the honor in Las Vegas during the Champ Show to honor a group called Forgotten Not Gone. That's a group of veterans who are committed to saving veterans who are on the verge of suicide because of the awful struggles that they're having with acute and chronic pain from service-related injuries, and how kratom, along with some other programs that Forgotten Not Gone manages to deploy, has actually helped people dramatically. It is a marvelous organization, and we were honored to step with them, to step up and honor them as our Advocate of the Year. We need to now honor them, and we need to fight for our rights for each one of us to be the Advocate of the Year and start to fight back against the FDA in what we're doing. This is an important step for us. It is an important time in our effort. Now, one of the things that I would also comment on and advise on is that we know that one of the biggest detractors to the kratom movement in the United States today are those families that have suffered these losses, who honestly believe that kratom was responsible for the death of their loved one. Set aside whether the merit of that argument is right, they honestly believe it, and they're passionate about it, and they've got the support of all of these trial attorneys in helping them. And I know it's easy to engage in the warfare with them on a regular basis to fight back against that. I think that that's ill-advised. I think that we allow them to have their view on this. Hopefully, they'll come to the realization that the thing that is best served, because science doesn't document the ability to ban the product, that we should regulate it appropriately. And hopefully we can come together to advocate for that. And I know there's some in that community who say exactly that, but fighting with them doesn't make any sense. Let's respect them. And I know, I get it. They say, because of the passion they have for it, they say ridiculous things. We as kratom consumers, in the midst of those verbal battles, say dumb things, say irrational things, say highly offensive things, and we need to stop it. I've been called a murderer, and it's offensive. And I know that my family doesn't like that. And it's not true, but yet that's what comes from the passion of this kind of thing. A murderer because I promote responsible regulations to allow for kratom to be consumed safely in the United States. That's my defense to it, but that's not the way that our enemies look at this. I think we've got to have respect for one another, accept where we differ, but we also should unify to the more important battle that's in front of us as we work forward. And I encourage everyone to do it. This is an important time in the battle about kratom because we can choose what path we want to take. Do we want the path of success that allows us to argue and to win the bureaucratic and the legal battles on kratom? Or do we want to just devolve into internecine warfare between one and another? I know that there are some in the kratom community that are not fans of regulations. I'm talking about consumers. I'm not talking about the vendors. I know where the vendors are, the vast majority of them. And many of the vendors that are currently in place, if these regulations put in place, they are not going to be able to survive because they can't afford to do what's required in order to produce a safe kratom product, and they should be gone. And the consumers that want to advocate for this nonsense that says, oh, we don't need the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. That's just the AK acting on behalf of the big vendors, and they want to protect the vendors. It's not true. We want to protect the consumers because this marketplace doesn't exist unless we have safe products that are manufactured properly in the context of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which no one in Washington will support that position that you shouldn't have any regulations. The reality is that we live in this world where we have to responsibly regulate the industry, and that's what we work for. And thank goodness for those vendors who are willing to step up and voluntarily submit to the framework that if the FDA were regulating kratom appropriately, they follow the AKGMP program, and those vendors are agreeing voluntarily to do it, and they submit to an independent third-party audit. We're improving that program all the time. We're refining it. We're making it tougher for the bad actors to be in it. We just added labeling to it this time, and this latest iteration of the improvements in it. We're going to do what we can to protect the marketplace for consumers, and we encourage everyone to, if you're looking for a safe product, that you don't look at price, but you look at those that are acting responsibly. Go to our website and buy from those vendors because they're trying to do the right thing along the way. And the only way we protect ourselves is that we have a consistent set of regulations where vendors are doing their best to produce products consistently that are safe. Always can be mistakes occasionally. That's why the regulations are in place to identify vulnerabilities, but we can't do it unless we have your support. And I'll conclude and then open it up for questions, thanking all of you. Thanking those of you that are honest brokers in this process who really share with us the view that the best way to protect this marketplace, to protect the kratom consuming public, is to responsibly support those kinds of regulations that allow for the safety of all consumers to be protected. So thanks, everyone. We're going to be leaning on you heavily. We've got a game plan in effect where we're going to be fighting back against the FDA. We're going to be calling them out. We're going to need your help. Stay tuned for a fly-in virtually for Congress in September, October, where we're going to be promoting the Kratom Consumer Protection Act and getting co-sponsors. And we're going to raise our voices loud and above the nonsense of those that seek to destroy the kratom marketplace, whether it's ourselves or whether it's our enemies or it's the FDA. So stay tuned for that. Ryan, I'll turn it back to you. Glad to answer any questions anyone has.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mac. Our first question is, hi, Buddy the Swamp Water Guy here. I've been a kratom advocate for over 4 years. My TikTok hashtag 2.2 million views. Does the AKA have a way to get speakers such as myself to the consistent council meetings to tell my story? There are a lot of good advocates I know that would speak if they had a way to the meetings. I'm still mad that no one showed up in Louisiana.
Well, great question. I'm disappointed that people didn't show up in Louisiana, but this is a tough fight. People have lives. Sometimes these meetings are scheduled at inconvenient times for people because we have lives. I get it. And now it's going to require a greater level of commitment, a more significant sacrifice going forward, because the FDA statement is going to empower. It is literally going to empower the anti-kratom people at the state level. And you're going to see more and more of these attempts to ban kratom. So we're going to have to redouble our efforts. There's no question about that. We can discuss and certainly contact Ryan directly about how we can deploy advocates to these meetings in localities where you're going to see inevitably see an increase in the proposals to ban kratom at local levels.
Great, thank you. And any state-specific regulatory updates in states that recently passed a KCPA? I know Oregon and West Virginia now have registration requirements. What about other states like Florida, Texas, and Virginia?
So Shane, this is one that it's kind of an uneven answer. some of the states enacted what we think is an excellent framework for regulating kratom. Other states have elected to take a more broad approach to it and say, here's the affirmative standard. And because of battles that they have internally with regulatory agencies, and I'll give you an example, as the state of Florida. The Department of Agriculture resented the provisions in the proposed Kratom Consumer Protection Act that imposed a requirement on them to regulate in the marketplace kratom products. And what their anger was placed in is that they believe, the Department of Agriculture, that the Florida legislature had put unfunded mandates over the last 5 to 10 years on the Department of Agriculture that created an onerous situation for them to be able to do the job they were tasked to do. And so they decided to take it out on the legislature when the Kratom Consumer Protection Act was rolling through to passage, and they demanded that there be a fiscal note of $20 million. Now, let me put that in context. In the state of Utah, where you have the most robust regulatory framework, there are about 500 products that are approved by the state of Utah for market entry. They pay a registration fee of $380 a year, and that generates about $200,000 a year. So the universe of products isn't going to change. In the state of Florida, you will still have 500 products because those are obviously the products that are willing to comply with the regulations under the framework of the KCPA. And the $20 million, think about it, $200,000 and $20 million. The argument that the Agriculture Department advanced was, well, there's more people in the state of Florida than there are in Utah. That's true, but there aren't going to be any more products. And this is a regulation intensive environment for vendors. It's not for consumers. And so that was the problem. Now, there's some additional work that would have to be done to enforce it in retail establishments to make sure that they're complying with age-related things. But those resources are already in place because they enforce that for tobacco and alcohol and other age-related products that are sold in those states. So not a good argument. So we agreed to negotiate that. We passed the KCPA. We're in the process of doing that. So another example of probably the most over-the-top outrageous regulatory scheme on the other side of the spectrum is West Virginia. They went too far. They passed great regulations in terms of saying the kratom products have to be safe, but then they put a privilege tax on it, and then they put criminal penalties on possession of kratom if you buy it under the age limit that's set. And that's craziness. And they have onerous fees. So we're going to be back in those states working to tailor that to a more rational viewpoint. But these are products of sometimes a chaotic legislative process, but we're making progress. And the good news is that we are getting states to adopt the KCPA. It's just hard to figure out. In the state of Oregon, the regulatory agency came in and they took input. I was disappointed that the few number of the vendors that showed up for those meetings, and now it's not a perfect regulatory framework, and so the vendors are now squawking, get it, and they'll have to refine those things. So this is an ongoing process as we go forward. It's not perfect, but it's far better than it was before.
Great, thank you. And is there any new information regarding Indiana's bill to lift the ban?
So Indiana's House passed the bill to repeal the current ban and replace it with a KCPA on a vote of 53 to 40. It went to the Senate. The Senate was not convinced, and so they wanted to review it next year, and we're engaged in information sharing right now with people. There's some current concerns about addiction, because that's some of the nonsense that the FDA likes to promote, and that the addiction recovery industry themselves like to obviously engage in because they want to classify kratom dependence, which is a real problem, with kratom use disorder, like it's an opioid use disorder. But the weaning off of a dependence on kratom is vastly different than the signature effects of opioids that require sometimes very, very tough interventions with other FDA drugs, trading one drug for another that's less addictive than the other, as opposed to kratom, where you've got a relatively short period of time in order to go cold turkey off kratom, struggle with maybe a headache, runny nose. Now, the exceptions to that are psychological addictions, which is an entirely different discussion. But we're being misclassified in many of these areas. So we're working with these states, trying to get it right. It is an ongoing effort, and we're doing our best in that area.
And from John, is the Johns Hopkins study on kratom on track?
So there's a lot of research that's ongoing right now. Let me tell you, not in direct answer to that question, but tell you how ridiculous this situation has become. The FDA in 2021 announced that they were going to do a dose finding study and a human abuse potential study on kratom. The dose finding study should have taken 6 months, and the human abuse potential study should have taken about a year. They announced those in 2021. The problem was that they said to the contractors in their request for proposals that anyone who wanted to do the study would not be allowed to disclose the results without the specific written permission of the FDA. And so many of the leading educational institutions declined to even bid on it because they believed it was unethical. Now, the reason they believed it was unethical is because it is unethical. Using taxpayer-funded research in order to find an answer from a scientific answer should not have been restricted from the public because the FDA doesn't like the answer that they got. We don't know what happened. Has anyone heard? No, of course not. And that's very troubling to us. So it relies in large part on NIDA, the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, to look at studies, and it relies in some part on some private studies that are done by enterprising researchers who have a sincere interest in finding out the truth. So we're seeing a dramatic number of scientific research that's being published almost on a weekly basis now that supports our cause. So the specific thing that John's talking about, there is a Johns Hopkins study, various studies that are ongoing, and we expect that some of those will be revealed very quickly here in the near future. So stand by for those results.
Right. And what are the top regulations you would like to see the FDA and other agencies implement?
A standard for specific kratom production standards. So you know exactly how you handle the kratom product, because each product's a little different. Make sure that that's done. Make sure that the GMP requirements for training and the equipment that's necessary to produce a safe kratom product, clarify what the solvents that can be used as food grade solvents in the extraction methods for a kratom product that is extracted, and good labeling standards for specific to kratom. Those are the standards that we want. In the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act, there are a couple things that are done. One, it says that the FDA cannot use the new dietary ingredient notification process in evaluating kratom products. They have to evaluate them as a botanical supplement or a dietary supplement, depending on how the company wants to market their products, and then their associated requirements with that. It also says that the FDA cannot use the import alert as a blanket ban on kratom. They have to look only to those instances where they can prove, with the burden of proof being on the FDA, that there is a contaminant that is dangerous in the kratom raw material itself, not blanket ban kratom. It requires that there be a public disclosure of all kratom research that's being done with federal money so that we can see the results and evaluate them. And it requires that the FDA have a public hearing so that, after the public hearing, they have to literally publish the results of that hearing on an FDA webpage so that we're not exposed right now to the argument of groups like the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic and WebMD claiming, well, the FDA says this, because the FDA has today on their website disinformation about kratom. They still have Scott Gottlieb's comment in 2018 that kratom is an opioid. That has been debunked even by critics of kratom as being untrue, and yet it's up there. And how can a federal agency put disinformation on their website? You see that Commissioner Califf has put up the FDA rumors page, and it is his attempt to try to counter what he characterizes in the health sphere, disinformation being promulgated by social media platforms and on the internet. His agency is the biggest perpetrator of disinformation when it comes to kratom. He should clean up his own house before he points the finger at others. And not that it's not legitimate, he pointed at him, he's got to clean up the FDA as well. So those are the kinds of things that we want to see enacted, and those responsible regulations implemented for kratom products.
Thanks, Mac. And Melody's asking about an update on Nevada. Comment here, seeing places starting to ban kava as an adulterant. Not that it's been adulterated, but that it's the adulterant.
So kava is legal in all 50 states, and there's no federal ban on kava. Should there be an examination of whether the mixture of kava, which has no proven adverse effects that are significant, that would lead to a ban, and kratom? I mean, I think that's a legitimate course of inquiry, but the way that we evaluate whether or not there's a problem in the marketplace with products that are being marketed either combined or concurrently is you look at the adverse events that are registered with the FDA, the FDA's adverse event reporting page, and you evaluate whether you see clusters of adverse event reports or fatalities. And if there are, then the FDA takes appropriate action, does examinations, and there are warnings issued or there are bans issued. That's not the case here. This is all fiction that people are making up when it comes to this kind of situation. I'm not saying that there aren't adverse events where someone might have in taking kratom. You may have physiologically some individual problem that you can't take kratom or kava, but there's no good evidence right now. In the state of Nevada, you had a legislature that strengthened the existing Kratom Consumer Protection Act with a 2/3 vote of both houses, and you had a governor that walked in and said, "Oh, kratom should be banned." That is a ridiculous position. We've got to educate. It's a new governor. Got to educate him on this. He comes out of law enforcement, so he buys into the FDA's nonsense and disinformation. So we're working to educate them. Another battlefield that we've opened up that we have to take on that requires the support of the kratom community. But that's again a very difficult issue that we're struggling with in the state of Nevada. But we're going to win in Nevada. I'm not concerned that we end up with a ban there so much as I am with this disinformation being used by others in other states that they would follow. So we're going to work hard on that.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Mac. I believe we've covered everything else so far.
No. I see a couple others that are absolutely important.
Go ahead.
The best kratom I've ever had comes straight
Oh,
from
here you are. Yeah.
straight from the farmers with no middleman. Does a KCPA mean that I no longer buy from my Indonesian supplier? Damn right. And I'm going to tell you something. There's nothing different than the kratom that is harvested properly over in Indonesia, going through appropriate processing requirements, and that what you're buying from a vendor there, because I'm telling you, those harvesters, those farmers they can't afford to do what's necessary to test that kratom product. So I am telling you that if you're buying from a farmer and you say, "Oh, I can trust them. I've done it for years, and it's the best kratom I've ever had," they don't have better kratom. They have kratom that's not tested. They have kratom that's not going through the appropriate procedures in order to assure that it's protected. And that's why I said it's Russian roulette, because eventually it's going to catch up with us, because the reason you put testing in is to catch a problem. And it doesn't mean that that every supply is a problem. There are outliers. And when those outliers hit, when you've got E. coli and salmonella infecting a kratom product and it kills you, it's a tragedy for the person, you that think you're getting this great kratom from this Indonesian farmer that's always been great and it's the best kratom you've ever had. But it also is the death for this industry, because without self-regulation, without responsible regulation, that'll be the basis for the FDA to shut us down. So I didn't mean to be so harsh about it, but I am strongly opinionated about it, that it's not justified to do what needs to be done here in terms of having a good structure in place on it. There's another question. Some people say focusing on adulteration is going to make us lose. Nonsense, because the only protection we have against these trial lawyers and an FDA that's out of control is for us to call out the adulterators. And I know there are people that say there is no adulteration that's taking place. Well, tell that to Dr. Weinstock, who in Ohio testified right after our bill, and she was an advocate for decriminalizing fentanyl test strips. And she stood up while we were gathering to get our advocates out of the hearing room, and she was the first speaker on her bill. And she said, "Before I start on mine, I want to tell you, you should pass the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, because my son died of a kratom overdose." And I stopped, listen. She said he was a student at American University. He went out and bought kratom. He and his friends used it to help them get through all-night study sessions. He died because that kratom was laced with fentanyl. And I hear irresponsible people in the kratom community who will say, "Oh, well, if that were true, then why weren't multiple people dying of that?" This is nonsense. Someone adulterated that product and killed that kid. And what about the mother up in Michigan just 2 weeks ago that had a similar experience? And what about the scientific research that's shown that there are kratom vendors who are adulterating kratom products with spike 7-hydroxymetrogenine? Now, of course, that's an expensive process, and it's cheaper now to do it with fentanyl. But anybody that wants to make the argument that we should not be focused on adulteration, that somehow that's going to demonize the industry. No, it's going to protect it. And those people are irresponsible. And I've called out these people and said, if you want to have a reasonable discussion about this, not the profanity-laced discussions that they like to have on social media, not the unhinged discussions, but really responsible discussions about this, glad to do it. I think that we need to be alert to this problem. And it's not the only argument we make, by the way. I'm not suggesting that adulteration is the only reason you should have regulations. You should have regulations to prevent contamination, which is equally as dangerous if you don't have a good control in place to protect against it. And that's why I said a little earlier that that in fact you have these people in Indonesia that are just struggling to get by, and they're processing their kratom as best they can. You can't have any layer of safety and reduced risk without it being processed properly and done in a clean facility and tested before it gets out of Indonesia. I think that's the critical part of this.
All right, good. And any other closing comments, Mac?
If I sound energized, I am. The motivation factor here is that when you get the FDA spreading this kind of disinformation, when you get irresponsible trial lawyers who exploit this marketplace and demonize us, that's unconscionable, because they're doing it for a buck. They're not interested. And like I said earlier, if they were, they'd be going after the FDA for failure to regulate. That's malpractice at any level. We have vendors and consumers in the marketplace that aren't acting appropriately. We've got to clean up our own act. And in fact, the entire regulatory model for dietary supplements in the United States relies upon self-regulation. There aren't enough funds for the FDA to go out and do all of the kinds of inspections and the kind of enforcement on these areas in dietary supplements. So the self-regulation model works. That's why they have the MedWatch page, which allows consumers and medical professionals to submit any adverse event report. And that's where they look for clusters of those. We're tracking the FAERS database all of the time. And that's the way it works. We've got to join that community of responsible regulation and self-regulation. And we can't harbor in our minds this view that, oh, that's just overregulation. That's a violation of my freedoms. There are two kinds of constitutionally protected free speech in product use. One is free speech under the First Amendment, which allows people to make intelligent, informed decisions about anything that they want to consume for their health and well-being, and that's a well-protected right. But there's also commercial free speech, which has severe limitations on it, because if I'm a vendor, I can't put on my product that this cures opioid use, or it has significant acute and chronic pain goes away. It cures this or that. You can't say those things unless you have submitted the appropriate clinical data to prove that that's the case. And I'll just conclude with this. Does the FDA have a legitimate basis to say what they said in their latest missive, which is that that the FDA has concluded from available information, including scientific data, that kratom is a new dietary ingredient for which there is inadequate information to provide reasonable assurance that such ingredient does not present a significant or unreasonable risk of illness or injury? That's not true. It's completely untrue. The FDA has received scientific research that is the gold standard for determining whether there's a safety measure, a buffer of safety for kratom. And it's in the form of an oxycodone animal study, which has been published. They have that data. They don't choose to accept it. They have human clinical trial data that's been submitted to them, which demonstrates the safety and the acceptable addiction liability limits of kratom. They choose to ignore it. It's not that they don't have scientific information. It's just that the scientific information that they have doesn't comport with their own biased view against kratom. There is a pathway established by the United States Congress for botanical supplements to be approved, and it's been in place for about maybe 15 to 17 years. In the last 15 years, there have been 800 products submitted to the FDA under this botanical supplement pathway for approval. 500 of those products have submitted and gotten approval for study protocols under the institutional review boards that govern that kind of thing. So they meet a very high standard under FDA regulations for review by the FDA. 800 products, 500 of which in the last 15 years have gotten IRB protocol approvals for the review of their safety. 2 have been approved. 2. If there isn't a more damning indictment against the FDA for their bias against dietary and botanical supplements, it's that. And you look at the enforcement that the FDA has and their bias against dietary supplements in general since the passage of the Shea Act, it shows you that this is not an honest broker. This is not an agency that's acting in the best interest of the people of the United States. If they were, they'd be doing the things like enforcing the 75 complaints that we have documented and submitted to them. Instead, they speak out of both sides of their mouths. They say, "Oh, we don't have any evidence of this," and yet, on the other hand, they're failing to act when they do get evidence, even for bad actors in the industry. We are at the threshold of either yielding, caving in, or fighting. I choose to fight, and I think that it goes back to the great old adage that fate was whispering to the warrior and saying, the storm is coming. You cannot beat the storm. And the warrior ignored it. And the fate whispered again more loudly, the storm's coming. You cannot withstand the storm. And finally, the warrior turned to fate and said, I am the storm. That's where we are. We've got to be the storm that fights back against this irresponsible regulation. So I ask everyone to join this fight. Let's push for it. Let's set aside these battles that we choose sometimes to engage in with people that don't need to be listened to. They need to join the fight, join us in moving forward. And even for those detractors, they can join us too for responsible regulations. And even where we disagree on some things, we can find common ground there, which is to protect the American public, making sure that we don't have adulterated products or contaminated products in the marketplace. And let's make sure that safe products are available for people. So thanks to everyone. Look forward to the battle that's coming up over the next couple of months, which will be intense and require all of your help, and stretch and help us financially, help us with your voices and your activity, because there's going to be a lot of activity that you'll see over the next 60 to 90 days. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you all. And we'll be in touch in the next few weeks. Have a great night.